Hello, class. Thank you so much for being understanding that we are going to be virtually doing class by you watching this video instead of attending class. Earlier this week, we talked about 4 different theories to motivation. Those 4 theories were Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-determination theory, equity theory, and expectancy theory. But today we are going to focus on employee engagement. Now, when I say employee engagement, a formal definition of work engagement is a relatively enduring state of mind referring to the simultaneous investment of personal energies in the experience or performance of work. Now, what I think is very interesting about this is the word simultaneous. This is meaning that the individual and the organization are both invested in one another. And this is what's really going to foster engagement. We also know that individuals who are highly motivated tend to be more engaged at work. And that's why I think this topic is very relevant to what we covered earlier with those 4 motivation theories. When I was a graduate student getting my master's degree, there was a guest speaker that came to campus and talked about work engagement. And he started with a very simple story, but I think it serves as a great illustration of engagement. So I'm going to kind of tell you the recap of that story. He said, I want you to imagine a piece of crumpled up paper. Now, the employee that crumpled up this paper and threw it on the ground is someone we would consider actively disengaged. The employee that sees the paper that's crumpled up and left on the floor, but just walks by it, doesn't do anything, just walks by, we would consider someone that's more neutral in the workplace, so not engaged. And the employee that walks by notices the piece of paper crumpled on the ground and throws it in the proper bin is someone we would call engaged. Now, this is a very silly story and simple example, but I think that it illustrates engagement quite nicely, and it's pretty memorable. So, in essence, someone who is engaged, these are the people that are very active in the workplace. They want to see the workplace strive for success, and they are willing to contribute how they can to make it successful. I also like this small infographic. So it shows that only about 29% of people are classified as engaged at work. These are people who are loyal and psychologically committed. They tend to be more productive, and they tend to stay with the company for longer. Interestingly, we see that 52% of people would be classified as not engaged. So they might do their jobs, they're productive, but they don't have a sense of connection to the company. They might miss more work days, and they're more likely to leave. But then we notice 19% are actively disengaged. So they're physically present, but psychologically absent. They're unhappy, and they honestly want to spread that unhappiness within the workplace. What might be a little bit better of this infographic is if those people in red, the actively disengaged, were actually holding oars and trying to go in the opposite direction. But I digress. As an organizational development consultant, it really is our job to focus on the people who are classified as actively disengaged and not engaged. It's our mission to get everyone in the company to be at high engagement levels. And that might be an unrealistic vision and hope, but it's something we strive for. Next week, we will discuss designing of a motivating work environment, but I want to focus a little bit, give you kind of some sneak peeks, if you will. So when I thought was interesting, I found this article and it was about employee engagement trends of 2018. So this was a little over a year ago now. But here were some of the top trends. One of the statistics is similar to the infographic. The infographic says 29%, and this one says 31%, but current engagement levels for the US and Canadian workers is only 31%, meaning less than a third of our workplace we are classifying as engaged. We know that millennials make up 35% of the working population, and these people are driven by open communication. They tend to be more achievement oriented, and they want to work for a place that has a great company culture. So, what I think is interesting is earlier when we discussed motivation, we talked about how bosses might try to incentivize their people through raises, like bonuses, for example. But we see that millennials aren't really driven by that. And they make up 35% of the working population. And they will continue to start taking over the working population. So that percentage will grow larger and larger. So when we think about how can we engage our workers, it's about this transparency, about goal setting, and about the culture that we're building that will really impact them. We know from research that leaders who are more compassionate are generally better at driving engagement levels. We know that people are looking for constructive feedback and feedback on their strengths. So, what I mean by that is it's important to focus on both. There is research in positive leadership that actually offers a 3-to-1 ratio. So, for every one constructive piece of feedback you have, you should be using about 3 positive feedback, so things that people are doing right. We tend to associate the word feedback with something negative, something I'm doing wrong and need to get better at. But feedback can be offering people compliments or encouragement to continue what they're doing, but also something constructive, something they might consider changing in order to improve. We also know that individuals look for flexible work environment and work times. So earlier when we were talking about motivation and self-determination theory, one of the 3 basic needs is focused on autonomy. So here we can see this flexibility. And we also know that the way in which companies are currently measuring engagement levels are things like pulse surveys, feedback apps, and social networking tools. And of course, there are much more. And that's what we're going to primarily focus on for this lecture, are the different ways in which you could actually measure engagement. Now, of course, there are several different ways that people could go about this, but the ones that I will be talking about today are the Ulrich Work Engagement Scale, and that's split up into vigor, dedication, and absorption. So this is typically done in a survey. We'll talk about one-on-one interviews and focus groups, and this tends to be more of a qualitative way of measuring engagement. We'll look into exit interviews, which is a specific kind of interview someone might do. And we will also discuss pulse surveys, so something that happens more on a frequent basis. Before we jump into these different ways of measuring engagement, I want you to take a moment and create this table on however you're taking notes. And I just want you to jot down a few of your ideas. So when we think about qualitative ways of measuring engagement, so focus groups, what are some pros and what are some cons with this approach? So why would this approach be helpful? And what are some negative effects when we do focus groups or interviews? I also want you to think for a moment, what are some pros and cons of quantitative methodology? So again, this is kind of like that survey. So what are some benefits and what are some drawbacks? I'm going to be silent for a moment, and I want you to just jot down a couple of your thoughts. We'll discuss this as we go on, but jot down a couple pros and a couple cons for qualitative and quantitative. All right, hopefully that was enough time for you to jot down a couple of your ideas on the pros and cons for qualitative and quantitative methodology. So let's chat a little bit about these four different ways to measure engagement. Let's start with the Ultrich Work Engagement Scale. As I've already mentioned, there are three factors that contribute to engagement according to this measurement. When I'm saying this, we usually use the term like subfactors, meaning that vigor, dedication, and absorption, these are the different kind of categories that we would use to measure engagement. And all together is what comprises engagement. And vigor is characterized by high levels of energy and mental resilience. So when we think about, I'm really energized to do this project, I feel like I could keep going despite the fact that I'm hitting problems along the way. We would say that someone is showing a lot of vigor. Dedication is characterized by feelings of a sense of significance, enthusiasm, inspiration, pride, and a little bit of challenge. And when we think about this, it's all about you find a project that you're truly so passionate about. And that's how we would say that person's very dedicated. They're willing to put themselves out, put in the time and effort. And the last factor is absorption. Now, absorption is characterized by being fully concentrated and deeply engrossed in one's work, whereby time passes quickly and one has difficulties with detaching themselves. For those of you familiar with positive psychology, we would call this flow. I want to give a small example of a time that I've actually used this Utrecht work engagement scale. I was working with a tech startup, and as you can imagine, I was concerned that their burnout levels were going to be very high and their engagement levels were going to be very low. Interestingly, what I learned is that their vigor and absorption were very low, but their dedication was extremely high. So you don't need everything to be high for us to consider someone engaged, but certainly if someone was showing that they were high in all three, we would call them engaged. So what this told me is that people in the company were really passionate about the work they were doing, but their energy levels and their ability to fully concentrate were quite low. And this made sense because at the time, the startup was developing an app and it was focused on standing up against sexual assault. And most of the people working for this organization have been survivors of assault. So it makes sense that a lot of them were scoring high on dedication, the sense of significance and pride and inspiration, because they were working on something they truly believed in, a mission they could stand behind. But as suspected, living in a startup world, especially since many of them were still college students, their energy levels must have been very low because they were balancing a part time job, an unpaid job for this startup, and being a full time student. And then we can also see why that would keep them from being fully engrossed in their work if they have so many other things happening, like the part time job and school. So that was just a small example of a time that I've actually been able to use this scale in the workplace. And I thought it was extremely helpful because then when I was thinking of ways that I could help the employees at this company, I knew where to focus my efforts. I knew that I could pull from this sense of significance, enthusiasm, inspiration, because that was really well established. But thinking of ways to foster mental resilience and concentration were going to be needed. Now, I want to chat a little bit about some pros and cons of qualitative methodology. So, that would be the one on one interviews and focus groups. One of the major benefits is in depth understanding. So, when we have the ability to sit down and ask people questions, and when we get their stories, their experiences in the workplace, we learn so quickly about what's really happening. Another benefit is that when someone tells us a story, we have the ability to ask a follow up question. This is something we cannot do on a survey. So if someone's a little vague or they're not being open enough with what they're telling me, then I can ask follow-up questions. And this further feeds into in-depth understanding. There's also something really interesting that whenever you say, oh, I'd like to start doing company-wide interviews, and you start scheduling interviews with people, people kind of perk up. Oh, you want to talk to me? Oh, you're interested to hear my thoughts on what's happening at work? Oh, you want to hear about my experiences? So, simply paying attention to employees can even be an intervention in itself. So, when a consultant comes in and works with people, this itself can sometimes make changes. It shows the people that the company cares enough about them to hire the consultant and invest in them. Now, of course, with one on one interviews and focus groups, there are some disadvantages, like with any methodology. And some downfalls that I've identified is time. It takes a lot of time to, first of all, set up the focus groups and interviews, scheduling, getting rooms available, coming up with the questions you might want to ask. It takes time to do the focus groups and interviews. I usually do about 30 minutes per person for an interview, and then sometimes about an hour, even an hour and a half if it's a focus group. So it's not only takes a lot of time to set up and do it, but then it also takes a lot of time to analyze the data. You have to read all the stories. Usually I try to get permission to record the lectures so I can listen to recordings after and transcribe some of the information or thoroughly listen to the stories once again. So again, it takes time before, during, and after when you're using qualitative methodology. With time, that's money, that's resources. So we're pulling people away from work to come chat and tell me stories. And sometimes consultants are paid on an hourly basis. And like I said, it can take 30 minutes per person, an hour and a half for focus groups. Another potential downfall is you're relying on the fact that you have a good facilitator. So whoever is facilitating these focus groups and interviews, they have to be good at knowing when to ask follow-up questions. They have to get the group comfortable. Especially in focus groups, they have to make sure that when people are opening up, that whatever is said in the focus group stays in that room. But also that when people start building off of ideas, it doesn't get sidetracked or start getting into some sort of negative spiral. It's also really important as a facilitator to notice your own biases. So, am I accidentally leading people on to answer in a certain way? What am I doing? How am I interpreting the situation? So, these are all important factors to consider. A specific type of interview that I want to chat about are exit interviews. Now, I'm a really big fan of exit interviews. And to kind of explain what this means, it might sound kind of obvious, but when someone decides that they're going to leave the company, usually on their last day, you would schedule an exit interview. During the exit interview, you might ask questions like, what caused you to start looking for a new job in the first place? What were your views about management and leadership in this company? You might also ask questions about their coworkers or their teams. What are the key qualities and skills we should look for in your replacement? Now, these are just a couple examples of questions, but I think that exit interviews are extremely valuable and beneficial. A couple reasons why I think exit interviews are beneficial are that, again, we're getting that in-depth knowledge. But now that people are leaving the company, they actually might be more willing to open up about their true experiences. And that's what is important with the honest feedback. So again, it is crucial that you ensure confidentiality. So in a small company, exit interviews might not work out because it'll be obvious who provided the feedback. But if you work in big companies, you might do exit interviews every time someone leaves, but you put together a monthly report. So assuming that a few people left, you could put all of the information and compile it in order to keep it as confidential as possible. So some people are worried, well, if I speak badly of the company, will they give me a good reference when I'm working at another company or applying for a future job? So that's why confidentiality is extremely important if you actually want that honest feedback. It's also helpful if we want to gather information on changes that need to be made. So, in that question about what are your thoughts on management and leadership, what are your thoughts on the coworkers? So, perhaps this is where someone would open up and say some things that management was doing and it was hurting them as an employee, hurting their productivity, and ultimately caused them to leave the company. It's crucial that we gather this information so we can make necessary changes. I would like to pause for a moment and say that most of the methods that we're reviewing are very proactive. There's surveys, interviews, focus groups, but exit interviews specifically tend to be more retroactive in nature. A problem has occurred and now we are gathering data. We cannot change that person's experience, they're leaving, but we can implement changes to help other people in the company. So that's why I say this method tends to be more retroactive rather than proactive. This is kind of a silly little comic, but this is an individual performing an exit interview with the woman, and she says, "This exit interview has been so nice. Can you tell me if you have any job openings?" And that's kind of comical because it's an exit interview. They're trying to leave the company. But honestly, another benefit of exit interviews is that you leave a sweeter taste in people's mouth before they leave. So, giving them the opportunity to open up and talk about why they wanted to leave and offer suggestions on ways they can improve the company, they're more likely to leave the company feeling more satisfied and less likely to talk badly about the company to other people. So that is another strategic reason as to why you might want to implement exit interviews. In general, I want to talk about some pros and cons with surveys. And I'm hoping that you mentioned some of these in that short activity I had you do where you wrote out pros and cons with qualitative and quantitative methods. So, some benefits associated with surveys is that when you send out a survey, you could send it out to hundreds, thousands of people. So, you get multiple people all at once. This can be extremely beneficial if you're short on time or if you have a larger organization. I can do interviews with 300 people. And another benefit of survey data is it's generally easier to do some analysis quicker. I can put things through SPSS or R and get some means, some averages or ranges. I can compare different measures, and that tends to be quicker than having to transcribe all the focus groups and interviews and then qualitatively code everything. But of course, there are some downfalls whenever using surveys. And we can imagine the benefits of qualitative are going to be the downfalls of quantitative. So, some downfalls of quantitative are that we're lacking that in depth knowledge. Asking people to fill out a 1 to 5 Likert scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, is certainly not going to give us the level of information as an interview or a focus group. But again, short on time and quick analysis. Another downfall is there's no direct follow up to answers. So, what I was able to do in an interview or focus group, follow up on a question, or when they told me a story if I wanted to learn more, I can't do that in a survey. So, if someone says something like, I strongly disagree that leadership is compassionate with their people, for example. So, pretend that's a survey item. I don't have the ability to say, well, why do you think that they're not compassionate? Do you have an example that you can provide me? I don't have that ability. Now, there are many more pros and cons to qualitative and quantitative analysis, but these are some of the general main takeaways that I want you to get from this class. Now, let's talk about a specific kind of survey, and this is something called pulse surveys. These are becoming more common in organizations, especially larger organizations. And essentially, what a pulse survey is it's really short, quick surveys that happen on a frequent basis. So typically, organizations will have annual surveys, and these surveys are very, very long. and they only do them once a year. But a pulse survey is something that might be done once or sometimes even twice a month, but it's only 5 to 10 questions. Most of them would be a Likert. Maybe you'd have one or two open-ended questions. So these are some examples of, I have a couple examples of both. So what are relationships like with your coworkers would be an open-ended question. In what ways does your leadership team contribute to a positive work culture is another open-ended question. Would you refer a friend to work here? That's kind of a yes or no, but a follow-up why or why not would then become open-ended. Now, the reason organizations are doing pulse surveys is that they offer some benefits. Now, one of the benefits of a pulse survey is you're getting real-time measurement of employee engagement and satisfaction. So rather than send out a huge survey once a year where we're gauging their current engagement level one time every year, we are getting it on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis. So we're getting real-time measurement by using pulse surveys. Now, this is important because it allows for analysis of improvement over time. Again, if we're only going yearly, I can compare the year of 2018 to 2019, 2017 to 2018, 2018 to 2016, but that might not be as insightful. Whereas if I'm coming into an organization and I collect some data and I start doing pulse surveys once a month and I start implementing some changes in the workplace, now I can track engagement and see, oh, interesting, in January, engagement was very low. And towards the end of January, we implemented a new incentivization program for employees, and their scores have shot up since February, or now in February. For those of you who really enjoy research methods, you might notice that I am talking about this example in a very causal manner, that A caused B, when in fact it could have been something else in the environment, so it's something we need to be cautious of because this would be correlational data. And as we know, correlation is not causation, but that is a simple example of how we can say, these certain events happened in certain months, and we saw how that spiked either up or low the engagement levels of our people. So it's valuable to have that information. Another benefit of pulse surveys is it's a frequent reminder that management values member feedback. So if I'm obtaining feedback on a monthly basis, this is telling people that I don't just care about what you're doing or how you're feeling once a year. I'm checking in very often, 12 to 24 times a year. Now, can you see the difference that might cause and the excitement that might cause in people? I do say that with a caveat. If people are sending out these pulse surveys and gathering feedback on a monthly basis and doing nothing about it, now that could actually be harmful and demotivate people. And then people will not feel comfortable giving their feedback because they know it's being ignored. So it's important that if companies start pulse surveys, that they follow up on the feedback, that they implement change as a result. So I think what we're really talking about this week, and it just keeps coming up again and again, is transparency is key. If you're going to collect data and you're going to do something about it, tell people that it's a result of this pulse survey and their feedback that you're doing this. And lastly, I think that another benefit of pulse surveys is encouraging open communication. So a lot of leaders today say things like, I really want an open communication office. I want a place where we can openly communicate. It sounds really positive, but it's challenging to achieve. And I think pulse surveys are a really great first step in that direction. Eventually, hopefully the company would come to a place where anyone could speak to anyone about ideas or feedback and go to the manager, and they don't have to do it through a survey. But again, I think this is a good first step. Now I want to end class by talking about the article that was assigned for this week. Now this article was focused on creating sustainable performance. And this is a Harvard Business Review article, so it takes these academic articles and condenses it and talks about it in a way that's more user friendly. So I hope you enjoyed this article this week. What this article talked about are that happy employees are the ones that routinely show up to work. They're the ones who are less likely to quit. They tend to go above and beyond this call of duty. And interestingly, they attract people who are just as committed to the job as they are. The article went into a few statistics. They said 16% of people who we consider happy workers are better overall at their performance. The people who we consider happy workers or engaged are 125% less burnt out than their peers, 32% more committed to the organization, and 46% more satisfied with their jobs. So that really captures this business case. Why should leaders of organizations invest in their people's happiness and engagement? One of my favorite quotes from an article I read says that the best way to serve your customers is actually to serve your employees. And what this is saying is that happy employees feel comfortable at work. They feel supported at work. Their needs are met. They're motivated. They're engaged. And there is a business case of why leaders today should care about their employees. The article talked about 4 conditions for thriving employees. Now, one of them is provide decision-making discretion. What's challenging about this is what happens when mistakes are made. I like that this little recap says Facebook employees are encouraged to move fast and break things. They have a lot of leeway to solve problems on their own. So what we notice is that when managers give up some control and allow their people to make decisions on their own, and a mistake happens, right away the manager is tempted to take back that freedom because they made a mistake. But that is the opposite of what managers should do. Perhaps having a discussion on ways they can improve or how they would handle it in the future, but not taking away the freedom after giving it. It's actually through this learning environment that people will grow, but they have to feel supported to grow. Another condition for thriving employees is sharing information. Interestingly, we know that people are more effectively able to contribute when they understand how their work, so their specific job, fits with the organization's mission and strategy. This little excerpt says, workers at Zingerman's restaurants, right down to the busboys, get up to the minute feedback on every aspect of the business, from customer satisfaction ratings to the number of dirty mugs in the sink. So again, we're noticing that trend of transparency at work and sharing information with your people. We'll talk a little bit more about sharing information and why leaders tend to be resistant to doing this during the week we discuss communication. Another way or another condition in which employees thrive is minimize incivility. So what we know here is that when people are faced with incivility in the office, they're more likely to narrow their focus and avoid risks. So again, we kind of get this connection earlier to when we talked about equity theory, and we've talked about the 3 forms of justice in the workplace. This excerpt says, leaders at Cayman Consulting attribute the firm's 95% retention rate. That is huge. To a culture in which background checks look for a reputation for civility. Now here's where we can make the connection from past material that we've discussed of a person job fit versus a person org fit. Now just because someone fits on the resume and they can fulfill the requirements of the job, do they fit with your company culture? And what this article argues is that bringing people on that fit within the culture of civility, of justice, is more important than simply hiring someone that meets the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the job. And the last condition for supporting thriving employees is offer performance feedback. We talked about that a little earlier about the trends of 2018 in engagement and how people want both constructive feedback and positive feedback. Interestingly, we know that performance feedback helps people resolve feelings of uncertainty. So they don't know if they're performing appropriately. Is that what you wanted? Do you mind offering me some feedback for next time? These are kind of things that we might hear. This little excerpt says the mortgage finance company Quicken Loans has dashboards showing continually updating data on individual and team performance against their goals. So, this is saying that we can offer feedback through actual metrics and through conversations. And I do think it's pretty important to have both. The article also talked about the importance of 360 reviews. We briefly mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but 360 reviews are where someone would come in, and it's usually in the form of an interview, although it can happen in a survey. But they would ask someone who is a peer, someone who is a subordinate, someone who is a superior, and in some circumstances, a customer, to provide feedback on this person's performance. So, this is a 360 approach. Now, we learned that these 360 evaluations are a great tool in helping workers thrive because now they're getting indications of their performance from different perspectives. Most people would say, wow, that takes a lot of time, a lot of money. Is it worth it? Now, they're right. It does take a lot of time. It does come out more expensive. But people really learn from these 360 reviews. And what's really interesting is we get a huge response rate. Most people are excited to participate in these 360 reviews. Of course, you need to ensure confidentiality. But the article said that they even get a 97% response rate. That is huge, especially in surveys, interviews. Whenever you're asking people to participate in these things, it is quite difficult to get people to get involved in providing their inputs, their feedback, sharing their experiences, especially offering feedback to another person. Now, again, I hope you enjoyed this article. The past few minutes of me chatting about this article have really just been some of the highlights and main takeaways. Next week, we will talk about job design and work-related attitudes. And I would like for you to read the article on the folly of rewarding A. After that week, we will have our first exam. So please reach out to me if you had any questions about this lecture or if you have any questions about the upcoming exam. Again, thank you for being so understanding that I needed to make class happen virtually. And I will see you on Tuesday in person in class. All right, thank you.